One of the goals of my course is for my students to develop a very deep understanding of what a demand curve is and where a demand curve comes from. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to take a look at what we already know about the consumer choice problem, about how consumers are going to look at their preferences and at the prices of goods in order to figure out how much they're going to buy. So let's do an example. Let's look at the demand for beef and chicken. According to the USDA, back in 2009, the typical American was consuming 60 pounds of beef and 80 pounds of chicken. At that time, the average retail price of these products was $3.90 for beef and $1.75 per pound for chicken. And I pulled that information from the USDA. They have a food availability website where you can go and take a look at how much food people are consuming in the U.S. in case you ever wanted to look that up yourself. And there's also a nice database on meat price spreads where you can go look up these things anytime you're interested. So here's our setup. I've got three indifference curves, U1, U2, and U3, where the number indicates increasing utility. So U3 is more utility than U2, which is more utility than U1. I've got a red budget constraint, and that budget constraint is based on a price of beef of $4 and a quantity of beef of 80, and the price of chicken is $1.75. And so we're going to hold the price of chicken constant. That's our certus paribus. We're going to hold everything constant except for the price of beef, and we're going to move the price of beef a little bit and see what happens. So the horizontal axis is the quantity of chicken, and the vertical axis is, had that flipped. The horizontal axis is the quantity of beef, and the vertical axis is the quantity of chicken. And we're going to see what happens when the price of beef changes. In this example, the price of beef drops. So when the price of beef drops down to $3.50, consumers are going to consume more beef, and that makes our budget constraint swing out, and that allows us to get to a higher indifference curve point difference curve U2. Then we're going to lower the price of beef some more to say $3, for example, and that's going to cause our budget constraint to swing out, and that's going to allow us to get up to indifference curve U3, and we're going to consume 120 pounds of beef when the average retail price for beef is $3. So let's see that all together at once. And what I want you to notice is that you could trace a path as the price of beef falls from the first indifference curve out to the third indifference curve. We call that an expansion path. You might need to know that in some point in the future. So basically this is showing how our consumption is going to grow and expand as the price of beef drops. And what I want you to notice is in that little table on the right hand side of the screen, I've got a bunch of price and quantity pairs. That table on the right-hand side of the screen actually has a name. It's called a demand schedule. This is showing us, for a given price, how much is that typical consumer going to consume. And as that price changes, it shows us how our consumption is going to change. So right here we have our demand schedule on the right-hand side of the screen. I'm going to take this diagram and I'm going to resize it and reposition it for the next slide. So let me show you that. So this is our diagram, and I'm going to put right below it a different type of diagram. And on this diagram, I'm going to have the price of beef on the vertical axis and the quantity of beef on the horizontal axis. And now I've switched my beef to a nice good-looking piece of steak, whereas before it was a dairy cow, so it's actually meat instead of milk. So the top graph shows us the relationship between beef and chicken as the price of beef changes. The bottom graph is going to show us the relationship between the price of beef and the quantity of beef. And what I hope you noticed was that the amount of beef we consumed was going up as the price dropped. So I'm just going to take the beef quantities from the top graph and just pull them down to the bottom graph. And then I'm going to take the prices that we had before and just impose those onto the vertical axis of this graph. And I've got these points where when the price is $4, I get 80. When the price is $3.50, I get 100. When the price is $3, I get 120. And I'm going to draw a line connecting these points. And bingo, there it is. That's our demand curve. The demand curve is going to trace out all possible price quantity pairs. It's going to take a look at every possible price of beef and the quantity that goes with it, and vice versa, the quantity of beef and the price that people will pay for that particular quantity. And that right there is our demand curve. Now there's a little animation right there just to kind of show you that we've changed the graph a little bit. It's no longer chicken versus beef, it's the price of beef versus the quantity of beef. And here's a little animation to kind of show you how they trace out together, just because I like doing fancy animations. So there you go. You've seen where we get the demand curve from. You've seen that as the price of one of our products changes, we can trace out the demand curve for that product. And that brings us to the law of demand. The law of demand says that as the price of a good increases, the quantity demanded decreases. In other words, there's an inverse relationship between the price and the quantity. And what I want you to notice is it's not a relationship between the price and the demand. It's a relationship between the price and the quantity. So as the price of beef changes, it's the quantity we consume that changes. Alfred Marshall was the one who described that. He also described the law of supply. And here's the actual quote from his 1890 book, Principles of Economics. The amount demanded increases with a fall in price and diminishes with a rise in price. When you read that, use a British accent since he was a British fella. So demand is a set of price-quantity pairs. For each price, there's a quantity and vice versa. A demand schedule is just a list of these price-quantity pairs, and a demand curve is going to slope down to show the inverse relationship between price and quantity. So here's a little caveat, a thing to always remember, and something I want to caution you about a common mistake that people make about demand. People will often try to tell me that an increase in price will decrease demand. This is not correct. This is not what the law of demand says. Rewind if you have to and take a look at what Alfred Marshall said. He didn't say that a price change caused demand to change. He said an increase in price will decrease the amount demanded, the quantity, and a decrease in price will increase the amount demanded, the quantity. It's a very important point that you ought to write down, and I'll tell you what, I've got textbooks sitting in my office that make this mistake. And so if you make the mistake, you're not alone, but we're going to try real hard together not to make the mistake. Sometimes I even misspeak when I'm in the classroom and recording these videos, and I make this mistake, but we're all going to try better not to make this mistake because it's just a mistake and we don't want to make it. The other thing I want you to remember is that the demand for a product never really thought about the people who are making the product. The supplier is not relevant to this process where we figured out the demand for a product. The demand is based on feelings. I like to say the demand curves are very touchy-feely kind of things. They're based on how you feel about something. That's one reason why companies advertise, because they're trying to influence the demand curve, which is a whole different lecture. So demand's based on preferences, feelings, how you feel about a good. Is it a necessity? Is it a luxury? So forth and so on. It's based on your income. How much income you have will impact your demand curve. As your income goes up, demand's going to expand. As incomes drop, demand's going to contract. And the other thing, it's based on the prices of goods, and specifically whether or not the demand curve is going to move around on our graph is based on the price of related goods. If the price of chicken were to change, the demand curve we traced out a little bit earlier in this lecture would change as well. It would find a new location on the graph if the price of chicken changed. But if the price of beef changes, we just find a new point on the curve. Just to kind of reiterate that last point, the demand curve itself is based on the last slide, but the amount you buy, the quantity demanded, it's also based on feelings, and it's also based on income, and it's also based on the price of related goods. But the amount we buy is also a function of the price of the good we're studying. So if the price of the good we're studying changes, we're going to buy a different amount. And that's different than the demand curve shifting. The demand curve shifts when income changes, or when the price of related goods change, or when preferences change. I've got a lot of videos that cover shifts in demand curves, and those will be popping up soon, of course. Thank you very much for watching.